You are kneeling in the dirt of a Mexican jungle, brushing soil away from something small and hard. It is a clay dog, no bigger than your palm, 4 legs, a little snout, a crude, almost comic face pressed in with a thumb. And under each leg a tiny hole, worn smooth, where something used to spin. You are holding a toy on wheels. It is roughly 2,000 years old. And it should not exist, because the people who made it never built a wheeled cart, never rolled a wheeled wagon down a road, never used the wheel for anything you would call work, not once, not anywhere in their world. They knew the wheel. They shaped it with real skill. They gave it to their children to push across a dirt floor. And then, for reasons that took archaeologists decades to even start explaining, they refused to scale it up into anything bigger. This is the secret hidden inside a child's toy, and it is stranger than you think. That scene is not invention. It happened again and again throughout the 20th century, mostly in Veracruz, Mexico, as archaeologists began pulling small ceramic figures out of the ground. Dogs, jaguars, deer, birds, some on 4 little wheels, some with wheels standing in for legs entirely, an axle threaded through fired clay like a tiny hidden joint. At first, nobody knew quite what to make of them. They look like toys because they'd behave like toys. Push one and it rolls. An archaeologist named Gordon Ekholm, who spent much of his career studying ancient Mexico, was among the first to publish detailed work pulling these wheeled figures together into a real puzzle instead of a scattering of oddities. And the question he asked is the same one that should be nagging at you right now. If these people understood the wheel well enough to build working axles small enough to fit inside a child's fist, why does not a single wheeled cart appear anywhere in the archaeological record of the ancient Americas? No wagons rolling grain to market, no chariots on ceremonial roads, no carts hauling stone toward a temple. Just toys buried quietly generation after generation. For a long time, the easy explanation was that this was simply a technological gap, a civilization that had not gotten there yet, still one invention behind the wheel, using cultures of the old world. But that explanation collapses the moment you actually hold one of these figures. The engineering is not clumsy or accidental. The axle holes are drilled with real precision. The wheels are round, balanced, symmetrical, built by hands that clearly understood how rotation works and how to make it smooth. This was not a culture stumbling blindly toward the wheel, feeling its way in the dark. This was a culture that had already arrived at the idea completely, turned it over, tested it, and then deliberately walked past it. So what actually happened here? To understand it, you first have to stop picturing the ancient Americas as a smaller, slower version of ancient Mesopotamia, quietly catching up on the same path. You have to look instead at what these particular societies actually needed day to day and what tools they had to meet those needs. In Sumer, the wheel solved a very specific transportation problem: wide, flat river plains, domesticated draft animals like oxen, strong enough to pull heavy loads for hours, long, established trade roads connecting one city to another. A cart pulled by an ox on that terrain was a genuine leap forward, worth building, worth maintaining, worth improving over centuries. None of those conditions existed in the highlands and lowland jungles of Mesoamerica. There were no oxen, no horses, no cattle, no large domesticated animal anywhere in the region strong enough to pull a loaded cart for any real distance. The terrain itself worked against the whole idea: steep volcanic slopes, dense tangled forest, rivers that cut roads into pieces, seasonal mud that could swallow a wheel to the axle within a day. A wheel with no animal to pull it and nowhere flat and dry to roll across is not a technology waiting to be scaled up. It is functionally a curiosity, clever, charming, useless for hauling stone. This is usually where the story stops in most quick retellings you will find online. Missing animal, difficult terrain, mystery solved, move on to the next fact. But that answer only explains why the wheel was not useful for hauling. It does not explain why it kept appearing at all, generation after generation, carefully made, clearly valued, sometimes placed with real ceremony beside the dead. If the wheel meant nothing beyond a passing amusement, why did anyone keep bothering to make it, century after century, long after the novelty should have worn off? Here's the deep dive most people never hear, and it is where this story actually gets interesting. Archaeologist Richard Deal, who spent years excavating Olmec and later Mesoamerican sites, pointed to something easy to miss if you're only looking at the toys as objects rather than as evidence. Almost every wheeled figure recovered by careful excavation comes from a burial context, not a household trash pit, not a workshop floor, not a marketplace stall, a burial, placed deliberately beside the dead, the way you might place something meant to matter, not something meant to be discarded once a child outgrew it. And many of the animals chosen for this treatment carried heavy symbolic weight across Mesoamerican cultures, especially dogs. In several traditions that survived long enough to be recorded by later observers, including Aztec belief, dogs were understood as guides for the souls of the dead, walking beside them through a dangerous underworld journey toward final rest. A wheeled dog placed in a grave is not obviously a discarded plaything at all once you know that. It may be something closer to a small vehicle for a soul, an object whose entire purpose was movement itself, built to roll because rolling was the whole point of what it represented. Not a cart for grain, a companion built to travel. That single reframing should genuinely change how you look at this object sitting in a museum case. It was never trying to become a technology and simply failing. It was already something else entirely, fully formed, fully intentional, and a modern eye keeps mistaking it for an abandoned invention only because a modern eye has been trained, almost from birth, to ask, what did this move, instead of asking, what did this mean? Picture the moment it was made. A potter sits with wet clay, shaping a small dog by feel, pressing in eyes with a fingertip, smoothing the belly flat where the axle will pass through. This is not a rushed piece of scrap work. It takes time to drill a straight channel through fired clay without cracking it. It takes a second attempt, sometimes a third, to carve wheels round enough that they actually spin true instead of wobbling and catching. Whoever made this understood exactly what they were building, understood it well enough to make it work smoothly, and then chose to stop there, not because they ran out of imagination, because the object had already done its job the moment it could roll. But there is a twist here, and it is the part that should genuinely sit uneasily with you, because the evidence refuses to resolve into one clean answer. Some of these wheeled figures were clearly played with by living children, not just placed with the dead. Wear patterns on certain examples, smoothed axle holes, rounded and flattened wheel edges, show real, repeated rolling motion, the specific kind of wear that only comes from a small hand pushing a toy back and forth across packed earth over and over for months, maybe years. So the honest answer is not that these objects were purely sacred, mysterious grave goods misread by modern eyes as toys, nor is it that they were purely children's playthings, later repurposed for burial out of sentiment. The truth is messier and more interesting than either version alone. They appear to have been both, sometimes within the same object, sometimes split across different ones made for different purposes. A society can hand a rolling clay dog to a child for the pure, uncomplicated delight of watching it move, and separately place a similar object with the dead as a symbol of the soul's journey outward, without ever once deciding, along the way, that rolling things belong on a road hauling cargo. Those two uses were never in tension with each other in their minds, only in ours, looking backward and expecting one tidy explanation to cover everything. Think carefully about what that actually means. It means these people were not failing to invent the cart, quietly falling short of an obvious next step. They had already decided, as a matter of culture rather than ignorance, that the wheel's deepest value was not in what it could carry, but in what it could represent. Motion itself, the passage from one state into another, whether that passage was a child pushing a toy dog across a dirt floor for the 100th time, or a family sending a soul on its way into the dark. There is a second piece of evidence worth sitting with here because it strengthens this reading rather than complicating it further. The same societies who never adopted the wheeled cart were not technologically primitive by any reasonable measure. These were people who built precise astronomical calendars accurate enough to track solar and lunar cycles across centuries. They engineered enormous stone temples without a single metal tool, cutting and shaping blocks with stone, obsidian, and relentless patience. They moved multi-ton stones across miles of difficult jungle terrain using ramps, log rollers, woven rope, and coordinated human labor on a scale that still impresses engineers today. These are not people who lacked ingenuity or who simply had not gotten around to a good idea yet. They solved their actual transportation problems with dense networks of raised causeways, canoe routes along rivers and coastlines, and stone roads built specifically for feet, not axles, because feet, unlike carts, could climb, wade, and adapt to terrain. A wheel never could. Compare that to what a wheel would have actually needed to become useful on that terrain, and the size of the gap becomes obvious. A working cart needs a road hard enough and flat enough to bear repeated weight without rutting into mud. It needs an animal strong enough to pull hundreds of pounds for hours at a time, and calm enough to be trained into a harness. It needs bridges or fords or some way across the rivers that cut through the landscape every few miles. None of that existed, and building it would have meant reshaping the entire physical world these societies lived in, for a benefit that human carriers, canoes, and causeways were already delivering well enough. The wheel was never the missing piece of a puzzle. It was a solution to a problem these societies were not actually having. So the real answer sits somewhere between the two simple stories you have probably already heard about this mystery. It is not that no wheeled toy ever existed, waiting to be discovered as a strange first. It is not that these societies simply never thought of the idea and stumbled onto it by accident. The wheel was known, understood, engineered with genuine precision, and deliberately kept small, kept personal, kept symbolic, because the practical case for scaling it up into a cart never arrived on their terrain, and the symbolic case for keeping it exactly as it was never really left. And there is one more layer to this that rarely makes it into the quick version of the story. The fact that these wheeled figures cluster so heavily around dogs is not a coincidence of survival, some accident of which animals happen to be popular. Across the deep timeline of Mesoamerican belief, long before and long after these particular toys were made, the dog kept reappearing as a threshold animal, an escort standing at the boundary between the world of the living and whatever came after it. A child pushing a wheeled dog across a floor was, whether anyone framed it this way at the time or not, rehearsing a shape that would later reappear beside a grave. The toy and the offering were built from the same idea, wearing two different outfits. Now bring that back to something you actually touch, maybe today, maybe this week. Every time you hand a toddler a toy car, a small plastic dog on wheels, a little truck to push across the floor while it makes a satisfying, faintly ridiculous engine noise, you are repeating an act that is at least 2,000 years old and quite possibly far older than the archaeological record has managed to prove so far. You assume, almost without thinking about it, that the wheel is obviously, universally, self-evidently, the greatest invention in the history of transportation. And in most of the world, it is. But somewhere in ancient Mexico, an entire civilization looked at that exact same object, understood its mechanics completely, and decided its highest purpose was not to move goods along a road at all. It was to move a child's imagination across an afternoon, or, quietly in the dark of a burial chamber, to move a soul into whatever came next. That clay dog in the dirt was not a fossil of a failed idea, some evolutionary dead end waiting patiently to be corrected by history. It was proof of a choice, made and remade by thousands of hands across generations, that some inventions are not stepping stones toward something bigger and more impressive. Sometimes the small version is not the shy beginning of a technology that never quite grew up. Sometimes the small version was the whole point of it, all along. You are kneeling in the dirt again, if only in your mind, holding that small clay dog, running your thumb over a wheel that never grew any bigger than it needed to be. And the strange truth waiting inside it is not that ancient people missed something obvious sitting right in front of them. It is that they saw exactly what you see when you hand a toy to a child today, felt the same small, uncomplicated joy in watching something roll, and quietly decided that was enough.